Hello there. Welcome again to another episode. Apologies for the late video. But anyways, let's talk about whether communism is an economic or political ideology. Now, economic ideologies like, for example, capitalism and socialism are defined by their relation to the economy. It makes no description on how things should be run other than that certain economic systems should be followed. For example, public ownership of the means of production, private ownership of the means of production. Makes sense. Feudalism as well is similar. It says that land should be owned by a few aristocrats and that this should be hereditarily managed. Now, of course, there's a lot more to it, and feudalism is a bit more of a collection of systems rather than its own specific system. Because go figure, it was one of the largest systems for a long time, and so there's a lot of variation in how it was actually handled. But these economic systems, they make no claim on how, for example, the country should be run. Feudalism, so long as you have that feudal structure, you're good. It doesn't matter if you're an absolute monarchy, divided into several more decentralized states, like, say, for example, the Frankish kingdoms had, or you're a republic. So long as you follow the same manner system or the same structure, you're good. Political ideologies, on the other hand, make specific claims about how things should be run. For example, absolutism, liberalism, corporatism. Actually, that's more an economic one, so pop that one over there. And, of course, republicanism, and theocracy. Basically, these systems all seek to answer how things should be run. So Republicans will argue that a government based on a republic should be how things are. Theocrats will say theocracy. Liberals will have their own thing regarding the social contract and such. And absolutists will, of course, favor absolute monarchy. Now, all this being said, as one can probably tell by me mixing up corporatism, there's still some overlap. For example, absolutism and feudalism have a lot in common, or at the very least they have ties. Liberalism also has ties with capitalism, and socialism has ties with a number of ideologies. But let's talk communism. Now, communism is interesting because it has many different branches. For example, anarchism. The original anarchism, what we would now call anarcho-communism. And they basically just want to go straight to the envisioned kind of society. Then there's Marxism, which has a transition period. Syndicalism, which favors syndicates to help manage things. And a few others and offshoots. But regardless, these three should work as basic examples. Now, a lot of people try to claim that communism is economic. In fact, I recently had a teacher say that, which, given how wrong it is, or at least how wrong I think it is, and I'll go into why, was slightly annoying because it made me respect her even less. Because, oh boy, was that just one of the worst takes I've ever heard in a while. But let's look into that. So what does communism actually believe? What unifies all these things? Well, one, public ownership of the means of production. Specifically, the people. Where socialists will settle for the state owning it, communists argue for the people specifically owning the means of production. Cashless society, so no money, socialists allow for this. And classless. Alongside that, it argues for what's called workplace democracy. Basically, the people who are in a workplace decide how the factory goes. So, for example, let's say you had a bunch of farmers in a co-op. According to workplace democracy, those farmers and their laborers should vote on how the farm is managed, how it should be run, etc., etc. It's a factory, same deal. And basically, this is the end goal. It's important to emphasize this in particular. But what of socialism? Because socialism is itself public ownership of the means of production. Well, then that would be straight up socialism. Okay, so that part's just straight up requiring socialism to work. Makes sense, I guess. Cashless. Ignore the improbability of that. That doesn't speak really much to economics other than just no cash. And if everything's owned by the people, well, it's kind of irrelevant regardless. Even the Soviet Union actually tried to experiment with it when it was going through its socialist phase, so you could argue economic, but still, classless. Oh, that's purely political. Classes are a political structure. They can have an economic component, in fact, plenty do, but class is not tied to the economy. For example, one of the more infamous ones was the Tokugawa. And they made several different strata for different people, with, of course, the shogun and the emperor at the top. But I want you to look at who they put at the bottom. Merchants. Now, was this exactly the same with merchants actually being lower than peasants? No. Plenty of merchants were still well respected because, they had the money to be well respected. But in terms of actual class, like how the state was supposed to treat them, the merchants were lower than the peasants because they weren't deemed as valuable to the society, to the political management. Classes are a political thing. They're about management. How you organize them, that's the question. For example, a meritocratic person will say, we want our classes to be based on skill and proficiency. People should fill whatever class they must fit based on skill. Some people will instead say, wealth should determine what your place in the class. This is where a lot of oligarchs get their ideas from, those who support oligarchy. And of course, there are those who believe in inherited class, aristocrats. And you see clearly, this isn't an economic thing, that's political. The abolition of class, as the Marxists understand it, is an abolition of a political structure, not an economic one. And finally, workplace democracy, again, public. It's about how things should be run. It is quite literally saying our democracy should go to the workplace. So the structure of one person, one vote, that goes to the workplace. Each factory worker, same vote, same administration. It is quite literally taking the idea of localism and pushing it to the means of production. Now, does it affect the economy? Yes. Let's face it, these two things are intertwined. They're not fully separate. They're intertwined, but importantly, they are distinct. Economic is how your economy should be run, how trade should be organized. Should it be free? Should we be protecting it? Should it be regulated? That is what, fundamentally, economics focuses on. Who should own the means of production, and how should we regulate that means of production? The management of society as a whole is political. You could argue, much like classes, that workplace democracy has an economic component, and indeed it does. But fundamentally, it is a political system. It is political management. Because what matters is politics. How people are voting, how people are deciding decisions. In the end, it is political. And so, with socialism straight up being copied, that leaves one economic idea and two political ones. It is a political ideology. And this is before we get into actual pragmatism, because communism fundamentally cannot work. As stated, there are 3 different types of communist thought. Importantly, let's look at Marx first, because he's kind of the guy who kickstarted the big push for communism. Now, what are the utopians? Those are the people who set up random communities out in the west of the Americas and started doing insanity. But they tried to do their best to institute communism. By the way, all of them failed, pretty much. And one of the weirdest ones was a utopian society that now makes cutlery. Oneida. It's freaking wild. But basically, Marx had his theory of material dialectics, or dialectical materialism. And basically, it applied the idea of basically thesis, antithesis, synthesis to what would become communism. He essentially argued that dialectics determines how things go. So, you start off with tribes, primitive communism, which, by the way, they weren't communist. There was still a clear hierarchy. There was still a lot of inequality. They were not equal or communist. They did what they needed to survive, and oftentimes that would result in classes being formed and other such things that notably are not this. And they competed, and eventually from that came slavery, the slave system. And then, of course, there's a competition between the elites and the slaves. And it results in feudalism. Which again, competition over material conditions. And you get capitalism after that. Now here's where we are. Capitalism. In the eyes of the communist, specifically Marx, what should happen is socialism wins out, and then after socialism succeeds, here comes communism. Now there's a few problems here. One, this transition here is where things really get stuck, because according to Marx, there should be a dictatorship. Specifically, a dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, as you might already guess, that dictatorship is never surpassed. We have never had a successful dictatorship of the proletariat transition to communism. In fact, we've never had communism in the plan Marx laid out, because fundamentally it cannot work. Now, it's just the fact that it says there needs to be a dictatorship at all kind of indicates it's a political theory, not an economic one. That's basic pragmatism. Last time I checked, the capitalists aren't arguing for a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. No, they just say free flow of goods and the private ownership of capital and the means of production is what should be done. Same thing with socialism. They don't say there should be a dictatorship of the socialists. They say the means of production should be public, so owned either by the state or another public entity, like syndicates, unions, etc. They make no claim of dictatorship. Marx does. It's political in nature. But the dictatorship is also where communism falls apart. And the anarchists fall apart for a different reason. See, the anarchists believe they can go basically from capitalism straight to communism. Here's the issue. The transition. Again, how do you make that transition? You can't, really, successfully make a direct transition. It is why the Marxists advocate for state socialism first. Because what you need to do is publicly control the means of production, get that socialism done, and then you can sell the people who are currently managing the co-ops, syndicates, etc. Okay, you manage this now. We've gathered all the stuff up. It's on you now. But the anarchist thing, no. We can just go straight to communism. No, you can't. And you can't voluntarily do it because guess what? There's always going to be that one dude who wants to keep his private property, and considering the abolition of private property is required for this to work. Because again, it relies on socialist public ownership. Guess what? You're not going to succeed. Because those people who keep their property to themselves, oh, they're no longer contributing to anarchism. They aren't contributing to communism. Therefore, they are an enemy. And thus, their property must be seized. And so you're going straight back to the socialist dictatorship of the proletariat again, only this time it's the popular mob just seizing everything. Syndicalists are a bit different because, well, they're syndicalists. They argue for syndicates, and so there's a lot more structure, but again, it runs into the problem of here. That's not happening. You cannot abolish class. Because, again, class is based on influence. The shogun may not be the richest man in Japan, but he's the guy with the stick. This is the guy who has the most influence. In more Republican governments, like, for example, the United States, you're not going to have the dude with the stick actually being the most powerful one. Because guess what? Sure, the president may be powerful, but he's got donors, backers, voters, people who carry their influence for him, and thus they become more influential as a result. And so, influence can also be from speech, from wealth, from just general ability. And so there will always be a class. There will always be strata. It may not be as enforced as, say, the Indian caste system, but it'll always be there. There will always be some class. And so you can't abolish class. There will always be those who are above others, whether you like it or not. And as a result, this will stay. And so they're basically in a perpetual state of socialism, saying eventually we'll push for the political aims. But they can't, because their economic system doesn't work, and the political positions cannot be achieved. So in other words, it's a worthless ideology, but people still cling to it. People still like to assert, no, it's economic. Bull. Literally everything of theirs that is economic, besides maybe the cashless part, it's just rehash socialism. They literally just copied socialist homework and said, yep, new economic theory, when it's literally the same freaking thing. There is more difference between the Chicago school, Keynesians, and classical economists. And those guys all say they're the same economic system. They literally say it outright. Yeah, we're all capitalists. We just disagree on how capitalism should be. Here the socialists are with the communists, and they're saying, yeah, no, we're different totally, even though we copy the exact same economic policies. Legitimately, if you took socialist policies and then copied them down on a chalkboard and asked, hey, you there, Mr. Communist, do you support this? Guarantee you 90% of them, the communists will say yes. And of the 10%, like, say in the matter of cash, the socialists will be pretty darn close, even then, with the communists. Because again, when everything's owned by the state or the people, cash becomes functionally meaningless. What good is a means of exchange when everything's owned by the same person or the same group? It means nothing. Because you're not exchanging with anyone. You can't exchange with anyone because they don't own that thing. How can I buy your fish when you don't own the fish? It's just utterly ridiculous. But hey, I give them credit. They keep lying to themselves, so they're good at that at least. Anyways, that'll be all. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.